Hi everyone, I'm very happy to be here today, and I can't wait to share with you my ride-sharing science scientific approach. So before I get into the lecture today, I want to talk to you about who I am. So my name is Erica, and I am from the rural southern Mississippi, and as a result of me growing up in the rural South, I am very much addicted to the virtual gaming, farming game heyday. By this time in my life, I thought I would be married to Jeff Goldblum and bearing his children, but this is Jeff Goldblum's wife, and that's not me. I'm a voracious reader, and I would like to one day meet the famous Leontyne Price, an opera singer who's also from Mississippi. Today I want to talk to you about who I am academically. I am the founder and principal investigator of Community Noise Lab here at Boston University, and I want to share with you my journey to where I started out at and to where I am now as an advocate of the ride-sharing scientific approach. But the way that I'm going to talk to you about this story is through a tale of two journeys. The first being a journey of determination, the second being a journey of purpose, but both of these journeys have led to what I like to call ride-sharing science. So let's start with the journey of determination. So before I got into this field called public health, I was actually a starving artist. I made furniture and I was a professional bookbinder. But my studio, which was my apartment, is where I was 24 hours a day. But one day a family moved in above me, and they had two small kids who used to run the length of their floor, which was my ceiling, for what seemed like 24 hours a day. So as a result of that new experience, I turned to trusty Google to figure out what I was going to do about this situation. So how was I going to remedy the situation? So turning to Google, I realized that the problem was a lot bigger than I thought it was originally. But my end goal was to collect enough data to get them evicted or get them to pay some sort of monetary compensation for disturbing my peace and quiet. However, I realized very quickly that there were some significant strikes against me. Well, first of all, I had no street credibility. I was just a complaining tenant who was probably very annoying to my landlord. I had no legal credibility, so all of the legal documents I was reading about taking them to small claims court really didn't make much sense to me, and I didn't know how I was going to get my head around that. I had no academic credibility. Like I was saying earlier, I was just complaining about sound issues, and I had no acoustics credibility, so I knew that I was going to have to gather sound data in some sort of way that would hold up in a court of law. And most importantly, I was battling this prevailing attitude that it wasn't that big of a deal and I would just need to deal with it. And in addition to that, there were a series of questions that I had to get to the bottom of. But through that series of questions, the one that really impacted me the most was, how is this impacting my health? And I was talking to a very trusty friend, and she told me that I think that you would like this thing called public health. And up until that point, I'd never heard of public health. So I decided to take one for the team. I moved out of my apartment, I dropped the lawsuit, and I decided to enroll in a school of public health. So the first stop on my journey is an academic approach. So before we talk to you about this academic approach, I want to talk to you a little bit about the background of sound and why it's important. So sound is essentially an audible wave that travels through our environment, and we characterize sound in one of two ways. We characterize its loudness by using the decibel. I'm sure most of you have heard of the decibel, and we also characterize it by its frequency. So that's essentially what sound is. But how is sound impacting our health? I really like this noise reaction model by Wolfgang BUSPH. And essentially, we are exposed to some sort of sound level. And it impacts us in either a direct way by, hearing loss or disturbing our sleep, or an indirect way by messing with our emotional stability. But regardless of these pathways, it leads to some sort of stress response. And that stress response leads to things like increased output. You can kind of envision yourself being exposed to some sort of sound that you view as unpleasant, and then you having some sort of stress response, some sort of fight. I'm going to fight this or I'm going to flee it. But that stress response leads to things like increased cardiac output, and over a period of time, that consistent stress stimulation leads to the manifestation of serious diseases such as hypertension and in some cases, strokes. So we can look at the epidemiological literature to see these impacts. So we can see that as low as 40 decibels, we begin to see things like changes in our mood disruption. But as we increase the sound level, we begin to see more serious health impacts. And to put things into context, 40 decibels is just a little bit louder than a private office, the sound that you would encounter in a private office, whereas 65 plus decibels would be around the sound levels associated with a normal conversation or a vacuum cleaner. So back to my academic journey. So I enrolled into public health school and I did a bunch of different things. I exposed people to sounds and monitored their cardiovascular and stress responses. And as you can see in this picture of me, I actually went out into Greater Boston and collected sound measurements. So in that process, I synthesized all of that data and what I thought would be my mic drop moment, these academic publications. So, I was I felt like my job was done, I had solved the problem, and I was moving on. But in actuality, that wasn't the case. So I like this quote. It's a quote that I'm sure we've all heard before. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around, does it really make a sound? So for me, while I thought that those academic publications would be my mic drop moment, it actually wasn't. A couple of things. First of all, it's public health. I was studying public health, not publication health. And in my world, at least what I was beginning to see is that research without translation is extremely superficial. And most importantly, noise, which I thought I was studying, is defined as unwanted sound. So I had never really talked to anyone about what was unwanted. And so for me, I felt like if I was going to do this right, I would definitely need to engage the community. So for me, if I'm going to talk about what's unwanted, I need to ask people what is unwanted. So for me, a big thing about me doing this academic approach and the kind of takeaway from that was that while I published these papers, at the end of the day, I left out a significant part of the conversation, and that is the community. So the second step on this journey of determination is a community approach. So after that, the academic approach, I decided to take a step back and engage the community. So in that process, I created a website and an organization called Noise in the City. And the sole purpose of that website at the time was to house a survey. So I wanted to survey people in Greater Boston and ask them about what they felt about noises in their communities, noises in their neighborhoods. And through that process, I was able to find out more information about the unwanted part of noise. In addition to surveying people, I also interviewed a lot of different people throughout Greater Boston and was able to gather a bunch of really amazing anecdotal stories about how people are dealing with noises in their communities. So I'm going to share with you a few of the responses that I got from people. So one of the quotes that I really liked that I believe really changed the course of my research was, there's some noise that I hear and some noise that I feel. So immediately I'm like, well, what kind of noise can you feel? I'd never really considered that before. But it kind of led me to realize some of the limitations in our current epidemiological analyses. So when we talk about noise, we usually only consider how loud it is, and we really ignore those sounds that we feel. And let me tell you a little bit about what the sounds that we feel are. So if you remember a little bit earlier in this presentation, I talked to you about what is sound, and I told you that sound was characterized in two fashions. It's characterized by how loud it is, and it's also characterized by its frequency. So to talk a little bit more about frequency, here are two sound waves. And as I told you, sound waves move throughout our environment, and the time it takes for a wave to repeat itself over the period of a second gives the sound its character. So if we see this sound that repeats 4 cycles per second, has what we call a lower frequency characteristic, and a sound that repeats itself more rapidly over the period of a second is what we call a higher frequency. So to put that into perspective, so I take the bus number 47 in the morning to get to work. And if I'm at the bus stop waiting for the bus to pull in and pick me up, sometimes, usually if the bus hasn't had proper maintenance, the wheels, the brakes start to squeak as it pulls in to pick me up. So if I put my fingers in my ear, I can sort of mitigate that screeching sound. That screeching sound has components of higher frequency sound. But as I'm putting my fingers in my ear, I can still feel that rumbling in my chest. And that rumbling in my chest are sounds that have lower frequency components. So as a part of my research, I'm very much interested in how those sounds that rumble in our chest, even if we've blocked our ears, how is that impacting our health? So in regulatory policies, when they're regulating sound in our communities, they use what we call an A-weighted decibel. I'm sure you've seen it on various things. But an A-weighted decibel essentially says that the sounds that we process through our auditory system are the sounds that are most important. But I'm sure if you've been outside at any time, you realize that there are sounds that we can also process outside of our auditory system. So this was another couple that I interviewed when I decided to take this community approach. And they live in East Boston. And if you guys aren't familiar, East Boston is a neighborhood in Boston that is right next to Logan International Airport. So if we wanted to understand the impacts of sound in this community, my question is, why are we using the A-weighted decibel that penalizes lower frequency and higher frequency sounds? And while the A-weighted decibel definitely has its benefits, I feel like it's really inadequate for characterizing an environmental sound. And I'm interested in really getting down to the bottom of those sounds that we feel. And another resident that I interviewed had this quote, which was also very profound. She said that I am sensitive to noise. I feel like it impacts me more. So another one of the limitations of our current regulatory policy is that we really don't regulate how sound makes us feel. And just to put things in a little context here, here's a heat map that was generated from some of the real-time sound level measurements that I took and some of the survey measurements that I took. I want you to pay attention to the East Boston community here. So here is this side of the map. It represents the sound levels that we measured in East Boston. And so you see that the green represents, so the more red the area is, the louder it is. But you can see that East Boston, which houses Logan International Airport, is not necessarily the loudest part in the city. You can see these red areas here. There are louder areas. However, in this map here, we see the perception of loudness. And we see that in East Boston, people perceive their neighborhood to be extremely loud. So for me as a public health practitioner, which is the more meaningful metric? So all of that data, talking to the community, the sound level measurements that I gathered, I synthesized all of that data into a Boston noise report. And in that noise report, which is available online, we talked about who we interviewed, and we gave some sort of metrics to these things that I felt like we weren't capturing. So aircraft annoyance levels, more consideration to those sounds that we feel. What about noise complaints? And I want to share with you a really interesting survey result when we asked residents how they felt about sounds in their community. And I always tell people, usually I don't put what the responses are to, like what question they were responding to, but you can see here that if I didn't tell you that this was community noise, it would sound like people were describing sexual assault. But it's community noise, but what it tells us that a lot of our residents in these communities are suffering or feeling imprisoned by their community soundscape. And one of the things that I was extremely proud of in this process was developing these neighborhood noise report cards. And for the community part of my journey of determination, I thought that this was going to be my mic drop moment. Up until that point, at least to my knowledge, no one had really graded the environmental soundscape of the city of Boston. So I was extremely proud of these report cards. However, I was at a conference and a lady who looked very angry because she was waiting for me to stop talking, and she was like pacing around the podium, and she was like, two things. First of all, I never took this survey, so you didn't capture my voice. And second, I was at a community meeting and I was trying to tell them about the impacts of sound in my community, and they told me that you gave my community soundscape a grade of an A+. So I don't think you understand the harmful implications of your research. So again, what was supposed to be a mic drop moment ended up being a significant failure. Not only had I failed to capture her voice, I'd failed to represent correctly the issues that she was dealing with in her community. So a couple of things from this community approach and this journey of determination. So sound and noise are dynamic issues. So while I did this really cool noise report, the environmental soundscape changes every second, and I was unable to capture that change with just a static report. And second, community studies should lead to positive and tangible impact. So while there was, I thought, my second mic drop moment, it really had no impact, and in some cases was actually harmful. So taking that journey, the journey of determination, and taking an academic approach and a community approach led to some cold hard truths. But I don't give up easily. So I want to talk to you now about moving from a journey of determination, where it started with me trying to get rid of my neighbors, and now talking about what I call a journey of purpose. So the ride-sharing scientific approach sort of comes from this journey of purpose. So what is ride-sharing science? It is an unknown journey. So as I like to say, so for me, I'm a public health practitioner. I like understanding how the environmental soundscape impacts our health. So my final destination is always going to be public health. And my hypothesis is that sound and noise are harmful to our health. However, the journey that I'm going to take to get to that public health is unknown and undetermined, because this ride is about the process, and it's also about the passengers that I share my ride with. So ground zero of this ride sharing approach and this journey of purpose is founding the Community Noise Lab. So the Community Noise Lab is a lab that uses a bunch of different tools and advocacy strategies to help communities as they deal with their own environmental soundscape issues. So we support communities with the following tools. We have 8 state-of-the-art real-time sound monitoring stations that we employ in the communities that we share our journey with. We have a survey that is translated into Spanish, so there's an English and Spanish version, and it asks people about how sounds make them feel. And to address that static nature of the noise report that we released earlier, we developed a smartphone app that's available for both iPhones and Androids, where users are allowed to record their environmental soundscape in real time whenever they feel like it. So we've created an app called Noise Score, and what you can do with the app is you can create what we call a noise event. And the noise event allows you to measure the sound level and tell us a little bit more about how that makes you feel. And your responses are aggregated into what we call the Noise Score Community Noise Metric that takes into consideration those sounds that we hear, and it's those sounds that we feel, how it makes us feel. So I worked with a really amazing team of researchers in both the Department of Computer Science and the Department of Mathematics and Statistics, and I'll talk a little bit more about how the ride-sharing journey has really opened my eyes to a broad range of interesting collaborations. And we also conduct laboratory-based experiments where we look at the health impacts of sounds that are prevalent in these communities. And finally, we support the communities that we work with a series of community engagement events that we update the communities about the progress, and we just have them involved in every step of the way. So the picture that you see here is us at our Noise Score Community Noise Metric and smartphone application launch party. So I want to now talk a little bit about the passengers. So we're working with 11 communities across the Northeast. We're working in East Boston, Mission Hill, Andover, the city of Chelsea. We're working up in Maine and Peaks Island. But I want to spend the rest of the time today talking about a specific example of the Fenway, because I think it's a really good real-life case study of the ride-sharing scientific approach and progress. So I was approached by the Fenway community because they had read about my work, and they were really, really concerned about the sound levels emanating from Fenway Park. So for those of you who don't live in Boston, Fenway Park is the home of the Boston Red Sox. And during the off season, there's no activity there, but during the on season, you either have Red Sox games, and during the summer, you have live concerts. So while the community did move into the Fenway neighborhood knowing that there was a baseball field there and there would be sounds from baseball games, the purpose of Fenway Park changed over a period of time, where at one time it was just one concert that would take place, whereas period of years, multiple concerts would be happening there. So they wanted to understand the impact of concerts in their communities, and they wanted to gather some data to support a good neighbor agreement between Fenway Park, Live Nation, the organization that puts together the concerts, and the Fenway neighborhood. So while it wasn't really what I was originally thinking I would do with my in academia, I thought it was a really interesting avenue to take. I'd never measured concert noise, and I thought it was just a really interesting and tangibly beneficial exercise. So my journey sort of took a little swerve here into the Fenway community. So what we did was we measured sound levels at 14 sites during background, during Red Sox games, and during concerts. And we also encouraged the community to use the app and also record sound levels throughout the time of our study. So we were interested in a bunch of research questions. Most importantly, what is the impact of these concerts? So I have some news to tell you. I have some good news, some bad news, and some sad news. Well, let's start with the good news. The good news is that through our efforts, we were able to do the following. We were able to prepare a report on behalf of the Fenway community talking about how impactful these concerts were on the environmental soundscape. We were able to take that data and synthesize it into testimony. So we were able to provide expert testimony at the licensing board hearing. So the City of Boston has a licensing board hearing where they grant or deny these concerts each year. And not only were we able to have some sort of community impact, I was able to uphold my academic, the things that I need to be successful in academia, and that is an academic publication. So we were able to get a community document, expert testimony, and an academic publication out of this very simple sidebar. Now some bad news. The bad news is that the concerts are loud. So I don't know if you can see the graph here. Here are the sound levels of all of the concerts that we measured at over the summer. So here are the World Health Organization guidelines for daytime and nighttime sound. So we can see here that consistently the sound levels during these concerts are higher than WHO recommendations. The worst news is that, WHO really doesn't have recommendations for live concerts. So we compared it to World Health Organization criteria for road traffic noise. And the sad news. The sad news is that on December the 19th, the licensing board for the City of Boston actually took our findings and really didn't do anything about it. So they granted Live Nation 12 concerts next summer, but we'll be out there measuring next summer. So I like the Fenway example because it was a really great example of the additional products that we can get out of adopting a ride-sharing approach. However, I want to now take a minute to talk about why I think it's important for us to utilize this ride-sharing scientific approach. All right, the first thing, and for me the most important thing, is that it allows you to stay true to the public part in public health. So I know that you probably got a chuckle out of that. You probably got a chuckle out of me saying earlier that it's public health, not publication health. And I know I have demands as an academic researcher to make sure that I publish. But for me, at least if I'm going to do this, I'm going to stay true to the public part of public health. The next benefit is that because the journey is no longer a journey from A to B, that I'm taking all of these side tracks, you're exposed to new horizons. And in the process, it forces you to think outside of your comfort zone. And for me as an artist, I really, really, really appreciate the unknown. Right? So one of the benefits of the ride-sharing scientific approach is that it allows you to uncover the beauty that comes with the unknown. A lot of the times we as academic researchers are nervous about the unknown, but we're academic researchers. The scientific process is about the unknown. Now, can you convince a grantor about that? That's another conversation for another day. But I feel that institutions, academic institutions, and granting organizations should leave a line item in either your promotional application or your grant application where you're allowed to just travel the unknown and discover it. And there's lots of beauty in the unknown, even when it's uncomfortable. Another benefit of the ride-sharing scientific approach is that you are sharpened by the iterative process, as opposed to being beholden to the shackles of the prison, I call it prison, ivory tower industrial complex. I like to call, sometimes academia can feel like that. So learning and failing has tremendous benefits. And I don't think I would be the researcher I am today if I hadn't failed many times. For me personally, kind of along the lines of the unknown, you're constantly encountering problems that you don't know the answer to. And for some of us as academics, that can be a blow to the ego, right? We're supposed to be all-knowing. But that makes you realize that you can't solve these problems in isolation. And that leads to the allowance of interesting and innovative interdisciplinary approaches. So I don't think, had I not taken this ride-sharing scientific approach, I don't think I would have been able to work with people in the computer science department, or the mathematics and statistics department, or the psychology department. So for me, one of the best things I feel like that came out of this ride-sharing scientific approach is opening up your research to other fields. And the end products are almost certainly much more impactful rather than you doing it alone. So had you decided to just go from point A to point B, I don't think that the end products would have been as impactful. So for me, one of the great things is that I felt like going to testify at the licensing board hearing had much more impact. Unfortunately, didn't get the concerts situation resolved, but I felt that lending my voice to the community concerns was impactful. Next, you'll be engaging in research that's wanted and needed, and you'll have a bunch of people holding you accountable each step of the way. And I know that sounds kind of harsh, saying that if you're not doing the ride-sharing scientific approach, your research is not useful. That's not true. But you're going to be on the pulse of what people want. And people tend to be more invested in things that they feel can benefit them. And you're also just more keyed into what's happening on the ground. And I like to say, I don't ever want to be an academic colonizer where I'm just going in to insert my agenda and just hoping that the community gets on board. So for me, I feel like one of the great things is that being on the pulse of the community and tailoring my research to what their needs are, and not just exerting my will over the community. And since I am, at the end of the day, a noise researcher, I want to talk about how it has helped me to reevaluate some of my beliefs. I've talked to you about how it led me on this journey of purpose and journey of determination, but it also made me reevaluate some of my beliefs around community noise issues. So the first thing is quiet versus peace. So I'm going to skip to the next slide and I'm going to go back to the previous slide. But I really like this example from Washington, D.C. So there's a section in Washington, D.C. called Shaw, and they are very proud of their go-go music. So I don't know if you've ever heard of go-go music, but I encourage you to Google it and listen to it. It's amazing. But in this neighborhood, they would play go-go music outdoors all of the time. So as the neighborhood began to become gentrified, some of the gentrifiers started to complain about the soundscape and eventually got the go-go music to be shut down. However, the residents organized and was able to get the go-go noise music reinstated. But for me, that experience, like I didn't work with the community in DC, but I read about it and was really intrigued about it. But it helped me to understand that as a researcher, I'm actually not here to make things quiet. And I know it sounds weird coming from a noise researcher, but my goal is not quiet, because quiet has its own set of implications, right? Usually the people who have the power to shut people up are people who have major influence. So I don't want to come in and shut people up, but I do want I want the data to be used as a series of negotiations. Quiet may be part of that negotiation, but it is not the end product. So it really helped me to think about this concept of quiet versus peace. And I like to do my research from a place of peace as opposed to just shutting people down. And I have a smartphone app, and For me, and I have these sensors in the community, and for me it was really important to think about the tipping scale between listening and sensing. So anybody can go out and put a sensor, air pollution sensor, noise sensor, whatever kind of sensor. You can always put a sensor anywhere. However, what's really important is I need to make sure I'm listening and not just collecting data. So for me, I always want to make sure I strike a balance between listening and sensing. And I felt like I wouldn't have that sort of empathy if it hadn't been for me sharing my ride with other people. And, you know, I have an app and we like to call it citizen science, but it's really, really, really giving me pause about how I define citizen science, right? Some of the people that are sharing this ride with me are undocumented, right? So I'm like, hey, citizen, use this tool. That seems a little weird. So I'm trying to reevaluate what I call these terms where I'm engaging communities to use technology. And for me, most importantly, grants are investments, right? They're not just vehicles for salary coverage. They are investments. They're investments in myself. They're investments in the Ivory Tower industrial complex. They're investments in my research. They're investments in the people who are sharing the ride with me. And they're investments in communities that I'm not working with. They can use that data to combat their own issues, even if they're not working with me. But if they are investments, these investments need to see returns. And I'm not necessarily just talking about profits, although we as researchers shouldn't be ashamed to talk about profits. But we definitely need to receive returns, and not just academic returns. Our investments, these investments, need to see returns on a community level, on a social level, on a policy level. So for me, I feel like we should make sure that when we write these grants, we see our products as investments. So I talked about the go-go music, so I'm just going to skip to the next slide. And just to wrap things up, so all of our data, we're working to make sure that all of our data is open source, so eventually we will get the community library up and running, and we will, and on this community library, we will house reports, data sets, maps that create. We're doing podcasts, all kinds of things. All the data that we collect during our study will be on this community library where you can freely access. So to learn more about Community Noise Lab, I encourage you to go to our website, and I just want to thank you guys for joining me on this journey, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to read the questions and I'm going to try to answer to the best of my ability. All right, so I live in a large city and road traffic noise is omnipresent. What can people do about loud road traffic noise daily? How can we mitigate this exposure? This is a great question. So one of the communities that I worked with that I didn't talk about was a community that lives in Andover, and they live right at the intersection of, I get the highways mixed up, but two major interstates. And they are trying to gather data to advocate for a sound study. So I know I'm kind of going around the block here, but I feel like you need to make some noise. So in the sense that if you live near a major highway, maybe organize and try to get someone to collect some data and see how loud it is and to see if it puts you at harm. But unfortunately, one of the things about living in a city is that it's always going to be loud. Earplugs work really well, and yeah, I say if you can't organize a big study and you can't get your neighbors on board, I say I'm always a proponent of earplugs. And I actually live near a major train rail, and so I play like white noise. So I have like a white noise machine. It sounds like you're in the inside of an aircraft. So white noise machines also work. Okay, I love this question. What do you see as the role of urban planning teams to prevent, manage, or mitigate environmental exposure to noise? This is a great question, and I feel like urban planners, so I am an urban planner. I feel like one of the things that we miss, we don't consider sound to be part of the planning process. Like, we don't think about, if we have a mixed-use building, how it's going to impact the soundscape. It doesn't really enter in the beginning of our conversations about how we design our communities. So I feel like a very simple I don't know how to say it, like a thought experiment would be really beneficial as an urban planner. So I think you need to ask yourselves the additional question: what is the acoustical impact? What is the perceptional impact if I put a entertainment venue in a community? So I think that it just needs to be part of the planning process. Okay, you used the Fenway area in Boston as an example, which is very affluent. Is there any difference in noise levels between affluent neighborhoods and other less affluent neighborhoods? Can you speak about the environmental justice aspects of noise in different communities? Right, so Fenway is affluent in that the property values are really high, but there are a significant number of non-affluent people in the Fenway. So I just want to share with you quickly one of the comments that was at the licensing board hearing is that you guys, like when we were talking about sounds in the Fenway, the opposing party said that, well, you guys, if the noise really bothers you, why don't you go to your home on the Cape? So there are a lot of people in the Fenway who can't afford who aren't affluent. So in that situation, I don't think that we should just paint a neighborhood based on their property values, right? There were definitely people there who weren't affluent. But I do work in other communities that are less affluent. I work in the city of Chelsea. I work in the neighborhood of East Boston. And I definitely think that there is something to be said about how sound impacts less affluent neighborhoods. So first of all, I'll give you a brief example. I live in Brookline, Massachusetts, which is a very affluent city, although I'm very poor. And there was a power box outside near my apartment that was extremely loud. And within seconds, I complained and it was fixed the next day. Whereas in poor neighborhoods, I've been in neighborhoods where I've measured sound and the same power box issue that makes this like really annoying humming sound, it's been like that for months and months and months. So I feel like it's kind of like a hamster wheel type thing. Poor people feel like if they do complain about things aren't going to get done, so they don't complain, or they just have no faith in the system. And then people feel like, oh, they're poor, we're not going to do anything about it. We're just going to put everything there. We're going to, so I feel like in terms of like urban planning, that we just put a lot of stuff in poor neighborhoods because we know they don't have the power to fight back. Okay. How do you engage other people who do not see noise as a serious issue? That's a great question, and I feel like that's sort of the next step on this journey of purpose. So as a researcher, I have been fortunate enough to work with communities by virtue of the ride-sharing scientific approach who want to be there. But I feel like one of the disadvantages of the ride-sharing scientific approach is that you sort of miss out on that population of people who who don't care about noise or don't have the resources to invest in what it takes to do a sound study. But I definitely feel like that's one of the disadvantages of the approach. Let me see. Is the ride-sharing approach to all kinds of research? Yes, I'm a noise researcher, so I feel like I definitely was biased in terms of ride-sharing. But yes, I just kind of feel like the ride-sharing scientific approach is just you sharing whatever you're doing, sharing your journey with other people in a way that benefits you both and leaving space for the unknown and being comfortable with that. All right, I'm trying to see. Have you seen a significant collection of data using the Noise Score app? Yes, I have actually, especially around like festival time and things. So like a lot of people like to record sounds like during different festivals. So I get I'm like, what's going on in Nevada? Oh, it's a festival. So things like that. Are there studies looking at the impacts of noise in tandem with other exposures, such as PM? Yes, yes, there are definitely, and there are studies that have been published that look at the relationship between sound and air pollution. But yes, I definitely agree with you that it is very important to look at co-exposures with noise, but I'm not an air pollution expert. I'm sort of a one-track mind kind of person, so I only study noise, but there are studies definitely, especially in Europe. Okay, listen like there's any other questions. This is great. I really appreciated the questions. Did I miss? Oh, actually, I see a question. What direction do you see your research taking next? I feel like, this is one of the questions earlier, I feel like working with, trying to see how the ride sharing scientific approach works with people who may not want to get in the car with you. So we don't want to kidnap them, but how, like some sort of engagement around communities where noise is a considered issue, but they don't have the resources or it's just not on their priority list. So how to get people to take a journey with you when they may not be interested in taking a journey with you. I think that'll be an interesting thought experiment. How can you get involved with Community Noise Lab? There's a bunch of different ways. So like if you just want to sort of figure out what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, you can look at our social media posts. You can follow us on Twitter, you can follow us on Facebook, and you can also go to our website. But if you want to actually get involved, there's always room to help us along the way. We generally see lots of interns and researchers contribute their work, so you're more than welcome. You can just reach out to me if you're interested in working with us, or you could be a community that has some sort of issue that you'd like for us to help assist with. We are more than happy to do that. And if you want to take part in one of our experiments, you could just, again, send us an email. All the information is on our website. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you guys. This is such a great experience, and I really appreciate the questions. And always, if you didn't get a question answered today, you can always feel free to reach out to me outside of this, and we can have coffee. Thank you.